The rain that night had a strange rhythm, tapping against the tall windows like a restless messenger that wouldn't stop whispering. Eleanor Grant sat on the edge of her narrow bed, staring into the mirror on her dressing table. The reflection that looked back at her was not kind. The lamplight fell in slanted shadows, outlining the weariness etched into her face, the fine lines of worry across her forehead, the quiet resignation in her eyes. Her fingers, ink stained from hours of typing, rested on her lap as if too tired to move. She was 36, though life had made her feel twice that. Once she had dreamed of being a painter, of colors and sunlight and open skies. But the war had come like a thief, stealing everything: her husband, her home, her belief that life still held space for beauty. Now she lived alone in a small flat that smelled faintly of dust and tea. Each morning she took the tram to the insurance office, where she typed dull reports for men who barely knew her name. They called her Miss Grant, but there was nothing grand about her life. She returned home each night with aching fingers and the same heavy thought: is this all there is? Her mirror had become her only confidant. Every night she would sit before it, brushing her hair with mechanical movements, sometimes whispering to her reflection, "Why can't life give me more?" The reflection never answered, only stared back, a silent witness to her quiet despair. One gray afternoon, as she walked home through Fleet Street, the wind turned cruel, tugging at her coat and scattering bits of old newspapers through the puddles. Seeking shelter, she ducked beneath the awning of a second-hand bookstall. Most of the books were weathered, their titles faded, their pages curling from damp air. But one caught her eye, a small beige volume with a worn gold title, barely legible under grime: The Game of Life and How to Play It by Florence Scovel Shinn. She had never heard of the author, but something about the words "game of life" made her pause. Life had felt more like a punishment than a game for years, yet she was curious. She asked the vendor how much. He shrugged. "A shilling." She hesitated. A shilling was her last coin until payday. But she couldn't look away from the book. It felt as though it was waiting for her, so she bought it, tucked it under her arm, and hurried home through the drizzle. Her flat was cold, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones. She set a small kettle on the stove, then sat on the bed with the book. The paper smelled of age and rain. As she opened it, something fell out: an old train ticket, used as a bookmark, and one line underlined in faint blue ink: "Your world is a mirror of your mind. Change the thought, and reflection must change." Eleanor frowned. She read it again and again. The idea was absurd. A mirror of your mind. Her life was small and gray, not because of her thoughts, but because the world had crushed her with war and loss. How could thoughts change rent, or bring back the man she loved? Yet the more she tried to dismiss the idea, the more it lingered. That night she lit a candle and set the book on her dressing table. The mirror reflected the flickering flame, splitting it into tiny shards of light across the glass. For a long time she stared at her own face, pale, tired, and uncertain. The words echoed in her mind: "Your world is a mirror." She whispered softly, "If that's true, then I've been showing it all the wrong things." Her voice trembled. She straightened her back, almost embarrassed by her own reflection. Then she took a deep breath and said, "If the world reflects me, then let it reflect hope." The moment felt foolish, yet something inside her shifted, small, barely noticeable, like the first breath after drowning. She tried it again the next morning before work. Standing before the mirror, she said, "I am worthy of joy." The reflection didn't laugh. It simply met her eyes with quiet understanding. She made it a ritual. Every day she looked into the mirror and spoke to herself, sometimes bold declarations, sometimes whispered prayers. She began to say thank you for small things: a warm cup of tea, a kind word from a stranger, the faint sun cutting through London's grey skies. A week passed, then another. At first, nothing seemed different, yet everything subtly was. Her co-workers began to smile more when they spoke to her. Her boss, normally curt and impatient, complimented her handwriting. Even the old woman who ran the bakery downstairs gave her an extra roll by mistake. Elinor noticed that her shoulders no longer drooped when she walked. Her laugh, once a rare sound, came more easily. Then, one afternoon, during her lunch break, she sat sketching quietly on a scrap of paper. She hadn't meant to, or her hand had simply picked up a pencil and begun to move, tracing the memory of a landscape she had painted long ago. She was so lost in it, she didn't notice the man standing nearby until he spoke. "That's beautiful," he said. Startled, she looked up. He was tall, wearing a brown suit with paint stains on the cuff. His hair was dark, his expression curious but kind. "Oh," she stammered, trying to hide the sketch. "It's nothing." He smiled. "If that's nothing, then I'd love to see what something looks like." She blushed. He extended a hand. "Thomas Haverfield. I'm an architect, though I envy people who can draw like that." She hesitated before shaking his hand. "Elinor Grant. I'm a typist, not an artist any more." He looked at her for a long moment, then said quietly, "Once an artist, always an artist." That evening she sat before her mirror again. Her cheeks still held the faint warmth of that encounter. She whispered, almost shyly, "Maybe I can paint again." The reflection in the glass seemed different tonight, softer, lighter, as if smiling back at her. For the first time in years, Elinor felt the smallest flicker of excitement when she thought about tomorrow. Not dread, not numbness, but possibility. It was fragile, uncertain, but alive. And as she turned off the lamp and the mirror faded into darkness, a thought rose in her heart like dawn. Maybe the world wasn't punishing her after all. Maybe it had just been waiting for her to see herself clearly. She fell asleep with Florence Scovel's book resting beside her pillow, her last thought before drifting off a whisper, "If the mirror of the mind is true, then tomorrow I'll show it light." Elinor's small flat no longer felt lifeless. The scent of turpentine and paint filled the air where once there had only been cold dust and silence. Sunlight, when it came through the curtains, seemed to linger longer, falling across unfinished canvases and glass jars filled with brushes of every shape and size. After work she would rush home, her hands trembling with anticipation to mix color and bring something new into existence. It was as if the world had opened a hidden door the day she began speaking kindly to her reflection. Every morning she stood before the mirror with a small, quiet ritual. "I reflect abundance," she would say, smiling slightly, though she still felt unsure. "I reflect beauty. I reflect success." She would then close her eyes and imagine the kind of life she wanted, laughter echoing through her home, her paintings hanging in bright rooms, her heart light and free. And somehow, little by little, the outer world began to respond. A cafe owner down the street noticed one of her sketches and offered to hang a few of her paintings in his shop. "People like color," he told her. "It'll brighten the place." Within a week, 2 sold. The money wasn't much, but to Elinor it felt like the universe had winked at her. She spent half of it buying more paint and the other half on a bunch of wildflowers for her window, a symbol, she thought, of growth. Thomas had returned to the office several times since that first encounter. He always found an excuse to linger by her desk, to ask about a typewritten report, to borrow a pencil, to share a smile. They began to take walks after work, talking about art and architecture, about what it meant to build something from imagination. He admired her courage, though she never saw herself as brave. She only knew that for the first time in years, life was no longer gray. But prosperity, as Florence Scovel wrote, was not only about money or love, it was a mirror of the heart. And deep inside, Elinor still carried fear. One evening, as thunder rolled over London, she stood before her mirror again. The storm outside rattled the windows. She looked into her reflection and whispered, "What if it all disappears?" She didn't mean to say it, but the words slipped out like a secret she had been holding for too long. Her eyes in the mirror looked uncertain again, shadows of the old Elinor peeking through. She tried to shake it off, but over the next few days the world seemed to dim a little. The cafe owner replaced her paintings with newer ones. "They're lovely," he said apologetically, "but business is business." At work, Thomas told her he had been reassigned to a large project in Paris, 6 months abroad. He promised to write, but she saw in his eyes the distance already forming. The mirror in her flat, once a comfort, now seemed colder. Her reflection looked smaller again, as though prosperity had been nothing more than a dream she'd borrowed for a while. She avoided it for days, unwilling to see the truth it might show. One night, feeling defeated, she opened Florence Scovel's book again, hoping for comfort. As she flipped through the pages, she found another underlined passage, written by the same mysterious hand that had marked the first. "The outer world can only return what the inner world sends out." She read it again and felt her throat tighten. Was it me, she thought? Did my fear turn everything away? The realization struck her like a chill. She had asked the mirror for abundance, but beneath her words had still lived doubt. She had painted joy, but secretly feared it would vanish. She had smiled at Thomas, while already mourning his absence. She stood up, her knees trembling, and walked to the mirror. The room was dark except for the faint glow of the candle on her desk. Her reflection stared back, its face half lit, half shadowed, half believing, half afraid. She touched the glass with her fingertips and whispered, "I am not fear. I am love. I am light. I am divine supply." Her voice cracked, but she said it again. "I am not fear." She repeated the phrase over and over, until her voice grew stronger, until her reflection blurred through tears. Her heart ached, but it felt like something inside her was breaking open, not in pain, but in release. She cried without shame, letting all the years of bitterness and scarcity pour out. When the tears stopped, she felt lighter, empty, but peaceful. She whispered softly, "Thank you." The candle flickered. The mirror seemed to shimmer for a moment, and in the reflection she almost thought she saw her younger self, the girl who had once painted for the sheer love of it, before life had taught her to be afraid. The moment passed quickly, but she held onto the feeling as if it were gold. The next morning, something within her had changed. She didn't wake with the usual heaviness. Instead, she felt calm, the kind of quiet that comes after a long storm. She smiled at her reflection, not to summon abundance or beg for a sign, but simply to say, "I'm glad you're here." That day, she began to live differently. She stopped counting her sales or worrying about who approved of her work. She painted because she loved it. She gave away small sketches to neighbors, to children in the street, to the grocer's wife who admired her flowers. She stopped asking life to give her more and began giving more to life. One afternoon, she was painting in the park when a man approached her, curious about her work. He introduced himself as the owner of a small gallery. "You paint with emotion," he said. "There's truth in your colors. Would you consider exhibiting your work?" Elinor smiled, her heart steady. "Yes," she said simply, "I would." Weeks later, her paintings hung in a bright little gallery on the corner of Kensington Street. People lingered before them, speaking softly, sometimes smiling, sometimes crying. Her colors were alive, blues that sang, golds that glowed. The reflection of her new world surrounded her in every stroke. When she stood before the mirror that evening, preparing for the exhibition's opening, she whispered the same words she had spoken months ago. "I reflect abundance. I reflect beauty. I reflect success." But now the words carried no strain, no doubt. They were no longer wishes. They were truth. Her reflection glowed in the candlelight, serene and confident. She reached out, touching the glass, and felt gratitude wash over her. The fear had not disappeared overnight, but it no longer ruled her. She had learned the secret Florence had written of, that the law of reflection was not about forcing the world to change. It was about remembering who you already were beneath the fear. That night, when Thomas's letter arrived from Paris, she smiled as she read his words of admiration and longing. She was happy not because he might return, but because she had already come home to herself. As the candle burned low, she glanced once more at her reflection. It smiled softly back, eyes shining with peace, and she thought, "The mirror never lied. It only waited for me to tell it the truth." Years had a quiet way of slipping by, like pages turning themselves when no one was looking. The little flat on Brookfield Lane had aged with Elinor, but in a lovely, lived-in way, sunlight warming its wooden floorboards, ivy curling around the window panes, and canvases stacked neatly along the walls like memories made visible. The war was long gone now, the world rebuilt in color, and Elinor Grant, once a nameless typist in an insurance office, was a name whispered softly in art circles across London. Her paintings had found homes in cafes, galleries, and private collections, yet she never let fame harden her heart. To her, each stroke of color was still a prayer, a conversation with something greater than herself. That morning she awoke early. The air was crisp, carrying the faint smell of spring rain. On her dressing table sat the same old mirror, its silver frame tarnished with age but still catching light in its corners. She smiled at it as one might greet an old friend. The reflection staring back had silver in its hair now and fine lines around its mouth, but there was a serenity there that no youth could match. "Good morning," she whispered to her reflection. "Shall we make it a beautiful day?" The day was special. She had been invited to speak at the Royal Art Academy, where students wanted to hear about her work, her philosophy, her journey. She dressed simply, a cream blouse and a dark skirt, and slipped Florence Scovel Shinn's book into her bag. The same fragile, yellowed copy she had bought decades ago for a single shilling. The lecture hall was warm, filled with the low hum of voices. When Elinor stepped up to the podium, a hush fell over the room. The students expected perhaps a lecture on technique or composition, but she began with something different. "When I was young," she said softly, "I used to think that life was something that happened to me, that the world decided who I was allowed to be. But then I learned that the world isn't a sculptor, it's a mirror." A few students exchanged puzzled looks, but most leaned forward, curious. "You see," she continued, "whatever you believe about yourself, whatever you hold in your heart, the world reflects it back. If you think you are small, life will show you reasons to stay small. If you believe you are blessed, life will conspire to bless you. The world doesn't give, it mirrors." She told them about her first flat, the long years of emptiness, the night she found the game of life and how to play it, and how a single sentence had changed everything. She spoke of the mirror ritual, of learning to speak kindly to her reflection, of losing and finding herself again through art. Her words flowed like water, soft but filled with truth. A young woman in the front row raised her hand. "Do you really think thoughts can change reality?" she asked, her tone both skeptical and hopeful. Elinor smiled gently. "I don't think they can, my dear. I know they do, but not because they bend the world, because they change you, and once you change, the world must follow." The room was silent. Then, one by one, the students began to nod. It was not the usual lecture they had expected, but something deeper, a permission to believe in themselves. After the talk, several students approached her, eager to thank her or ask questions. One young man, his hands stained with paint, said, "Your words felt like sunlight." She chuckled softly and replied, "Then go and paint with it." That evening, when she returned home, the city was quiet. The twilight shimmered through the window, and the air hummed with the promise of rain. She set her bag down, poured herself a cup of tea, and sat by the mirror once more. The candlelight flickered, throwing soft golden hues across her face. Her reflection gazed back with familiar warmth. "Well," she murmured, "we've come far, haven't we?" The mirror didn't speak, of course, but in the play of light, she thought she saw her younger self, that frightened, lonely woman who had once sat here, begging life for more. She could almost feel her presence, the weight of her sorrow, the hunger for hope. For a moment, Elinor's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling, "for not giving up on me." In the stillness, something strange and tender happened. She felt as though time folded in on itself, that the girl she had been and the woman she had become were standing together in the same space, hands touching through the mirror. It was not a vision but a recognition, the understanding that both versions of her had always been reflections of one another, each carrying the seed of the other's truth. She stood there for a long time, watching the flame dance, the reflection shimmering slightly with its glow. The mirror, once a symbol of her emptiness, now held everything she had learned. That prosperity wasn't about wealth, but harmony, that abundance wasn't found, but remembered, and that every act of love toward herself had quietly rewritten her world. Later, she went to her studio, lit a single lamp, and began a new painting. The canvas was blank and pure, but she knew exactly what she wanted to capture. She painted a mirror, not cold or flat, but luminous, filled with the soft outlines of sky, sunlight, and faces half seen. In its reflection bloomed flowers, cities, and open fields. It was not a literal mirror, but a symbol, a reminder that life itself reflected consciousness. She painted for hours, lost in the quiet joy of creation, until the dawn light began to creep through the window. When she finally stopped, she looked at what she had made and smiled. The painting felt alive. It was her story told without words, her pain, her hope, her awakening. She decided to title it The Law of Reflection. In the months that followed, the painting became one of her most admired works. People stood before it for long stretches of time, whispering that it seemed to watch them, as if the painted mirror could see into their souls. Elinor never explained its meaning. She simply told them, "It's a reminder that what you see is always a reflection of what you give." On the evening of her 70th birthday, she sat once more before the mirror in her flat, the candle burning low. Her reflection was old, yes, but radiant, her eyes bright with gratitude. "You've given me a beautiful life," she said softly, "and I've given you truth." Outside, rain began to fall, gentle, rhythmic, comforting. The mirror flickered with candlelight one last time, and for a fleeting instant she thought she saw her younger self smiling back. Not sad, not lost, but at peace. As the flame dimmed, Elinor felt an immense calm wash over her. The mirror, the book, the art, they had all been teachers, each reflecting what she had carried inside all along. She leaned closer to the glass, whispering a final thank you not to the reflection, but to the life she had created from within. And as the night deepened and the candle finally went out, the mirror caught the faintest glimmer of dawn, soft, golden, eternal, as if even the universe itself was reflecting her light back to her one last time.